Welcome to the SJ Child Show. This episode is sponsored by Water and Body Basics. Visit 3440 South, 5600 West, West Valley City, Utah. Mention SJ Childs today. Hi, and welcome to the SJ Child Show. I'm your host, SJ Childs, and today I have a really special guest coming all the way from across the United States. I'm here in Utah. He is in Boston, but we can still meet up and have these little discussions and chat. Mateo Rojas, hello. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so grateful to have you here and honor your time and the space to be here with me. And we are just going to jump right in and let you go ahead, introduce yourself, please, and let the listeners and viewers know why you're here today.
Sure. So my name is Mateo. I'm 26 years old. Had a long journey with myself, being autistic and having a sensory processing disorder and all types of different disabilities growing up. But with all that I went through, for years I wanted to be a counselor working with autistic children, whether primarily teenagers. And for a while I did that, but I actually became physically disabled 3 months after I graduated college, because unfortunately that's just how life worked out. So I really, since I knew I couldn't do it being paid for in the field anymore or doing it full time, it really took me a bit to realize, like, I don't have to be at a job to help people or to talk to parents or to work directly with the children or with teenagers, because that we have social media now, and that's how ideas are spread, and that's where I left down a lot of my own learning and found my own form of the autistic community that I've really gotten close with. So I've been trying to create my own blog, which I have made since December 2019, and a lot of my posts I'll either post in different groups within Facebook or different social media channels, but also just really talking to people one-to-one. People reach out to me all the time after my posts, and so I've actually met with people that want to introduce me to their kids or to have advocated in IEP meetings. So it's been really cool to do that in this way that's very volunteer and very much in my own time, but that's, it was really empowering for me to be able to still give back and not have to worry about physical limitations or being rejected the minute I show up at the door. I know right now we're pretty much vocal, but I am going blind, and I'm in a wheelchair. So sometimes when I walk up to a door, and I was at a job interview, the doors were shut in my face right away. And so it just took a while for me to get past that and realize, like, there's something bigger out there, and that impact can still be made.
Wow, I am just so proud of you, as an autism advocate, as a mother, as a friend, just incredible. And thank you so much for being willing to come on here and share your journey with us and be vulnerable and, discuss some of these things. I think that one of the biggest recent feedbacks I've been getting from my autistic community family is teen help and how to help our youth and our teens navigate and really strategize the teen years. And so for you to have that as a focus, I'm sure that so many people have, really had what is the word I'm looking for? I usually don't run out of my words. Just really found hope and inspiration through those things. So, wow, that's just amazing. Let's talk about when you were diagnosed. Tell us about your, that time frame for you. If you were really little or if it was later on in life, what does that look like?
Sure. So honestly, if you look back at home videos, like those very typical 90s videos, I mean, it was really obvious even since I was like a 9-month-old, just with different stimming, things like that. My parents, I'm adopted, they didn't have the lingo back then, and also they didn't have social media back then. Even Google was brand new in 1998. So it was a very unknown world for them. So I think that they took the route of having me screened in kindergarten, if I remember correctly, because that was what our public school did, was they were starting to screen more for autism, since that word was being more known around that time. And so that was when they originally found sensory processing disorder. But then over time in kindergarten, first grade, they started to realize a lot more was going on, just with certain hindrances of communication, with certain delayed developmental milestones. And so eventually we actually got the diagnosis when I was in 3rd grade, which sounds kind of late, but in reality, looking back in it, I think a lot of it had to do with the fact too. I don't know if I've mentioned before on any of my posts that you've seen, but I'm transgender. I was born female. And unfortunately, with a lot of autistic girls, they get really overlooked. A lot of the literature
Yeah,
is about
absolutely.
young boys. And
Yeah.
so it's not, I don't like to gender autism too much, but like there is a different presentation of how we're socialized, or what's seen as acceptable, or what gets criticized more, and what gets overlooked more. So I think that's why things went so under the radar, even though I was
Yeah.
like pretty much classically presenting the same way that a typical autistic boy would. So in third grade is when I got the diagnosis. My parents were at an IEP meeting when they were told. I mean, they told me a lot of this years later, and
Yeah.
it was not a one-time conversation. I think that my parents did it in a way that I can respect, that they didn't overwhelm me with too much, because there was a lot to process, and not so much in a grieving way, because I don't like framing it as that, but it's just a lot to understand that now I have a word for why I was feeling the way I was, or why I was behaving the way I did. And like when I was younger, I was a lot more in my own worlds, not really aware socially, or just like, yeah, just kind of my own drama. But around third grade was actually ironically a time where I started to realize, like, wow, play dates, those are a thing. Oh, people talking to each other, like that's a thing, you know? So I started to pick up that I was different, and started to have a lot of internalized bad feelings about that. So to have a name for it in a lot of ways was relieving, but it brought up a lot of hard feelings too. So I think my
Yeah.
parents did a good thing by spreading out the conversation, that when an incident happened at school, whether it was with behavior or a meltdown or something like that, like I now had a word for it, and that's when they'd explain more about it. So they did it in little bursts.
I like
They
that.
didn't make it a one-time thing, because I've seen sometimes parents be like, how do I tell my child? And like, yeah, it can be a conversation where you sit it down, you know, like, and really go over like what it is, but you don't want to give too much at once either, to let it, like, let life happen, and then like give a name to what's going on, and not in a way that shames them, but more in a way
Yes.
that can empower them. Like, here's why, and like, there's other people out there like you, and like, here's what they did to get through it. Like, it just how depends on like how you word it to them. And I think my parents did a good job with that, but unfortunately my teachers did not. So that's where we
Yeah.
had the twist of the innocence, when it started that really rough teenage years, preteen years especially. Yeah, that's when the shift really changed to I hated myself for a long time.
Oh.
You know, so it
Oh.
was very hard to get through that, which is why I focus a lot on teenagers, because I feel like a lot of people bat for children in IP meetings, and then like after they hit 12, they just fall off the radar, and they're easily labeled as, you know, non-compliant or any of those negative terms. But like autism doesn't disappear. It just morphs. You know,
Wow.
it's just gonna look a little different as a teenager. So I think it was easy to forget that not everything was just a grumpy teenager at puberty. Like there was a lot more psychological things going on. A
Yeah.
lot of things went undetected for a long time, which did a lot of harm.
Oh my gosh. And I'm just so glad that you can share those things with us, because I'm sure that's real in so many families, and they don't have the understanding and education to recognize that, or to see it for what it is. And I want to go back to something you said, because I think it's really important. And it even is important now. I'm like, love how I learn in all of these situations, and can take something so valuable from this communication with you. When you talked about a grieving process, and you don't really like to call it that, and I have for a decade now, like, kind of advocated to new parents, like, it's okay to go through that grieving process. However, right here, hearing you say that in this very second, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I never thought about the perspective you might have, or my son might have, by hearing me say something like that. It does sound, unfortunately, I wish that, like, we had all positive terms in our community and our language of society, and that's just not the case. And some things just look and seem negative, without that intent, of course. But yeah, that's really interesting. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. How What would you say is a better way to have parents still go through the process of having to change their way of thinking? That's kind of the way I like to advocate it now. What would you say? What kind of advice would you give to new parents, instead of that, using the maybe grieving? What else? What kind of language can I learn to say better?
Sure. No, I think I'm really glad that you wanted to focus more on that, because it's a tough conversation. Sometimes I get a lot of pushback from that, because people are like, well, I have the right to feel how I feel. And I'm not saying that there's going to be a change in maybe how like you either saw your own future or your children's future. But I think we have to use language that reflects that this is society a lot of time that is an ableist society, right? Like
Yes.
a lot of time I was getting the messages like I'm a broken person because I'm autistic. I was in a
Ooh.
lot of these therapies that were making me try to appear more neurotypical when I wasn't, or to
Yeah.
learn in a neurotypical way and I wasn't. And so because autism can't be trained out of you, and that's pretty much what the inherently focus was, I just felt
Yeah.
like it was just this really bad pattern. And so what I tell parents is like, okay, like your child's autistic, but they are a perfect autistic person. They're not a broken neurotypical. And
Yeah.
so when we see disability as something that's broken or needs to be fixed, like that's where the grieving language comes in. But when we talk about how do we make school accessible for my child, and how do I make sure that my child will be safe at school, especially if they're nonverbal and can't tell you if they're being bullied or harmed, I think it's just about shifting into action. That like, okay, like this is how our child exists. That's not going to change, but how can we change the environment around him so this person can be happy, and so
Yeah.
person can be learn to have an equitable environment. Because I think that was really one of the biggest flaws for me growing up was I was in therapy all the time. And it
Mhm.
caused a lot of resentment because I was at school and I was burnt out from school. School was a lot harder for me because of all the sensory distractions, a lot of the social situations that were going on that involved a
Yeah.
lot of heavy bullying for both teachers and students. And so to go home, not have a break, have any time to decompress because I had to fix what was so broken about me, and I couldn't. It caused a lot of resentment and really set me up for my teenagers to have depression and anxiety, and pretty severely. Um, so I think we have to be careful about using the term grief, because what I heard when my parents would say that was like, wow, I'm a disappointment. I must be doing
Oh,
something. I need to do better
yes.
to make them feel better. And that I was just born, and so
Yeah,
we
of
wouldn't feel
course.
shame in either way. And so it's not even so much like anger towards parents that say the word grief, but just more like, if you catch yourself saying those words, like it's okay to acknowledge the feelings there,
Yeah.
but to label it as grief, I'm kind of like, you know,
Yeah.
so I think just take time to like relearn, how you see
Definitely.
disability, to take time to like reflect internally before we externally push the narrative that it's something to be inherently grieved.
And I 100% agree with that. And I really love that we got to discuss that because I agree with you. I like to sometimes bring up a little bit tougher subjects because our family, my family personally, we are not traditional. We are a non-traditional family. And that can be viewed by very, looking down at us or whatever. But by what you're saying, I feel right at this moment that we're giving our children kind of the best looking lifestyle for them because we allow them to be themselves. We allow them to even with our son who has irregular sleeping patterns, embrace those. We don't make him regulate those. That's his own biology. And who are we as other humans to come in and say, stop having a biological behavior that exists in your own human body? Sorry, we don't have time for it. You need to sit on our schedule. Like, I think it's absurd. And, I, of course, don't ever judge any other parents or anything, but I hope that they would also not judge me and possibly look to me for a little bit of guidance in a new way of thinking and a new way of looking at autism. Um, and, you and I just met, so you don't know also that my husband has Asperger's and we've been together for 17 years. And I am able to embrace and see the perspective from his childhood, his traumatic experiences, his never ending behavioral, abuse, and just, locking him up for his being autistic because they didn't know. It's just, it baffles me. And obviously now we have the chance and the opportunity to teach better, to be better, to say this is not right for our society and our future for autism and for embracing autism because it's just a new beauty. It's not even new. It's a beautiful way of thinking that's just becoming more society is just becoming more aware of it. It doesn't mean that.
More aware, exactly, but more normalized too. I mean, I have to
Yes.
remember sometimes when I get really mad or impatient that like really this has not been a conversation for a long time, because
Yeah.
institutions were the mainstream for a long time.
Yeah.
For a long time, it was either somebody would go with no support and they were just seen as the weird guy, or on the other end it was they were just an institution and these people were forgotten about and not cared about in a
Yes.
legislative form or personal form, and it was terrible.
Yeah.
So now that we're really evolving from that, we kind of have to shift like the direction of like how do we talk about autism in ways that is realistic and humanizing. And so a lot of time
Exactly.
I get a lot of pushback saying like, oh, you're ignoring the realities. I'm like, no, 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 I'm not saying that there's more severe disabilities. I'm saying we can talk about these in humanizing ways, where we're not
Yes.
throwing around functioning labels and putting people in categories and assuming that they have no autonomy or no desires and that their whole life has to be decided. Or on the other end, that like, oh, these people are fine, like, you know, they just have to conform to society. I think we're seeing a really good shift, and it can be a
Yeah.
scary shift for some people to hop on that boat, because it means that they leave a lot of other parts of the autism community over that look down on that. For example, I have a lot of ABA people who are in favor of it get really mad at me because I reject pretty much everything, actually everything that ABA says, you know,
Yeah.
of training you to be a certain way.
Right.
Um,
Right.
I
Yeah.
think that at least that I've noticed, especially after I became physically disabled, that people tend to think there's two categories, that you're either able-bodied or you're disabled, and that there's nothing in between. And I realize now, like, no, like in this whole universe of different culture aspects, different familiar, even in your own family or sociological, anything, there's a wide range of ways that a body can exist. And same thing with the mind. There's so many different ways. It's impossible to have two categories. And it's not one that you stay in. I think it's
Absolutely.
porous, that it you know, it varies throughout different times in your life and can vary throughout the day too, of how much energy you have, you know, and
I love that.
you know, like there's
I
some days that
agree.
I can do really well and you would never know. And there's days that I'm just melting down all the time. I mean, you're hearing me now, but just a month ago, I was in a psychiatric hospital for having so many meltdowns and I just needed help. I had to go back on medication. But,
Yeah.
you know, so how you can present can really vary. And there's some things that are more consistent. There are some things that are very consistent, but I think we need to be open to realizing just how complex humanhood is.
Yeah.
And I
Oh,
think this
so true.
way we talk about autism can be a really liberating thing, not just for autistic people, but for neurotypical people, to realize like it's okay if you need breaks. It's okay if you need accommodations. That I don't even like using the word accommodations. And it sounds weird. Not that a way that's offensive. It's not an offensive word at all. But I
No.
think it almost implies that there's a default way to learn. So I started saying the words access needs. Like, what do you need to
Mm,
access this space
I like
right
that.
now? Because I run a disability club. And so that's something that we started doing, is that what's your access needs? Like, do you need to take a few breaks? Does anybody need to lay down? Because it used to be, you know, you have to sit up straight and focus and look you in the eye. And I can't look people in the eye. I cannot. I know right now I'm on Zoom, so you can't tell, but it's one of those things, no. So like, it's one of those things, like I might not be looking in the eye and that's okay. Or I might
Yeah.
need to lay down, but I'm still listening, or my head might be down. So like we're starting to acknowledge as ways that people learn and process, and it doesn't mean it's wrong, it just is. And so
No.
that's why when we talk about autism, I don't like using the word grief, because like, nope, it just is. So now what will we do about it to make this an easier life for this person? And
Yeah,
that involves fixing the
definitely.
environment, not the person, because they can't be fixed, they're not broken.
Well, and I love that. And I love that I could learn something and be educated and even strengthen my message even more, to help parents out there, you know. And I completely agree with you in all 100% aspects of this. So I'm so glad that it's like when you find your tribe and you're on the same team and you have people's back and you can totally come from the same place in intentions of really helping people with the correct way of thinking, with the correct flexibility of thinking. It is just really where it needs to be. And that's, like you said, for all aspects of life, for all aspects of your day, of your everything, is that the more flexible thinking you can have for yourself and the grace for others, the better we're going to be in the future for everyone, right?
Right. So it's
So
more
so I love
sustainable.
that. Yeah,
Yeah, it's more sustainable,
absolutely.
so we don't burn out, because I mean autistic burnout is actual term. We are just so exhausted from pretending to be neurotypical, to strive to neurotypical standards, whether it's at
Yeah.
school, work, or anywhere. We can't do it anymore. We break down more. And that's a lot of time we see that, especially in adolescence, when
Mhm.
just like there's so much more social demands, there's a lot more academic demands, and like it's not like elementary school where you can have a lot more accommodations. That's why I get mad that like so much laxness goes away. That's a word, you know, once
Yes.
you get older. I think that that can stay there. And I think we have the potential for that, but people have to be willing to shift that. And as we
Mhm.
see a lot of pushbacks in IEP meetings, even over the most basic access need,
Yeah,
it,
that's
no,
crazy.
but that's why those fights are intense. I mean, I didn't get to go to my own IEP meetings till I was 14, but I mean, I heard some pretty awful stories from my parents of just some of the just pure manipulation that was going on, that they were really adamant that they could not possibly make certain accommodations, but it was really just a matter of them not wanting to or not making space for. And so, it was just, they wanted to keep a default. And eventually I was transferred to a special education school. And I had a very complicated relationship with that school as well. I think that they also pushed the behavioralism thing and conforming even more so, which was harmful, but in a lot of ways they gave a lot more understanding about certain things too. So it was very complex being in both spaces.
Absolutely. What would you say is the best type of communication style to build with a child or teen, like going into teen and adolescence? How can we best, navigate and build those communications with what's the best kind of advice you could give there?
Are you referring to with the teenager themselves or with the people around them supporting them? Because those are two very different conversations.
Let's discuss both of those, because I think those are both inherently important, especially in the family and school settings, and obviously church and community, but everything, right?
Yeah, no, I think with at least the teenagers themselves, I think that I was really underestimated because of just how I presented with certain behavior and that the level of support that I needed. I think that there could have been a lot more direct conversation, asking me like, what do you need?
Yeah.
Even if I had to type it or if I had to sign it,
Absolutely.
I think that still would have been something. They did have some communication charts where I could point to things that was helpful. But I was mad how long that took, because it was a lot of time people deciding things for me. And that caused a lot of resentment. It was this brutal cycle of me having outbursts. I was frustrated with the decision that I wasn't involved in such an important decision. Or just to be able to I don't know, just to let me experience things how I needed to experience them, like emotionally, that I was constantly, oh, don't cry right now, or, or don't, it was always that. So I think with teenagers, especially, you just have to just let them just be, and to realize that also, and I tell this to parents all the time, it's very easy when you're in such a disability culture to focus entirely on autism, but remember, they're also a teenager. They're also going through things too.
Exactly.
I feel like every bad day I had, oh, it's because of his autism. No, there was things going on. Like, I wish they dug deeper. Like, no, maybe he's being bullied. Maybe he's suffering from bipolar. It took them a long time to figure out I was having bipolar disorder and schizophrenia symptoms, because they kept framing everything and anything under autism.
Yeah.
And so same thing, that like if I was struggling in a class, oh, it's the autism. Like, no, is this teacher not having a good teaching method? What can we make learn? Like, is there any way we can accommodate him to make him learn better? I think when we labels can be helpful to help find community, but they can also be hindering if you only stick to that label and not assume anything else could be possibly going on. So it's just to see the whole person. So I don't say like, oh, don't see autism. Like, you have to in order to find them resources and also to understand their neurotype. But I think that don't forget the whole person's there and to look into every aspect, because I think a lot gets overlooked. So I'd say with the teenager, just talk to them if you can. If they are nonverbal, it doesn't mean that they aren't communicating. And to see behavior as communication. Like before, when I have my nonverbal episodes, oh yeah, I people assumed oh, but this is just autistic behavior. Like, no, I was either too hot, or the car was moving too fast, or the shirt was rubbing against me, which is why I stripped it off. Things like that. It happened more so when I was a kid, but yeah, that was a thing. Like, if it was bothering me and I take it off, oh no, he's doing this because he's autistic. Like, no, I was in sensory distress. So I think you have to realize yes, inherently that's what's going on. That's how we're wired. We're autistic, but it doesn't mean that nothing can be done about it, and it's environmental. So figure out what's going on that's triggering.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think that finding out the why behind your child's actions, rather than even just saying behavior, their actions, finding out the why behind those actions is the root. It's the key. It's the place to help them to find the strategies, or find shirts that don't have the tags. Just there's ways. There's ways to help your kids if you just look at them. And I couldn't agree with you more. We over communicate with our kids, which is best. It's best because I'm working with somebody in the community. We're working with the Children's Hospital to better advocate for their emergency services for autism and special needs. And that's one of the things I'm telling them. You need to communicate every single step that this child's going to go through. Over communicate, show them pictures, show them a video, tell them what's going to happen. They have the right to know they are human beings. We do not look at them and say they're children. They don't understand. They have autism. They don't understand. No, they are human beings first. And that's where we start.
Right. And that's why I like the approach of assumed competence, because a lot of time
Yes.
people say, like, oh, it's going to be over his head or it's too complex for him. And just because I couldn't communicate it verbally was really frustrating. It's like, yes, I understood everything. Even when I was nonverbal and people sitting talking about me in front of me was a really dehumanizing thing to go through for a very long time.
Absolutely. I'm so sorry.
My key example is when I moved into a group home, and that decision was made completely without me. And I remember I walked in the room and that's when they told me when I was moving in. So none of the steps that were happening before, not letting you know, like, this is why. It was very much like, oh, this is going to happen. I'm like, where was I in this conversation? I know I was a kid, but also, like, that's a whole life change for me. It's going to be a big sensory change.
Absolutely.
It's going to be staff change. It's going to be trust change. And so it just caused a lot of distrust too. So
Trauma. Yeah, absolutely.
Trauma for sure. And I would even call it trauma. Absolutely. I was thinking I was going to be discharged from the hospital, and instead, like, oh, we're moving to a group home. Like, so why wasn't I included in this? And that's not to say that children have the final say in literally anything.
Absolutely.
But it does mean that, like, they need to know what is going on behind the scenes, because I always felt like I was in for a surprise. I always had anxiety whenever I was brought into a room of adults. I'm like, okay, is this going to be a life change, or are you telling me we're going to the park? Because who knew? Because I was not communicated with.
Yeah.
Based on behavior or anything or just my learning disabilities. Oh, he's not going to understand. It's like, now they
Yeah.
see how fluently verbal I am. People are like, oh my gosh, like, he knew the whole time. But it's like, I shouldn't have to be this verbal for people to treat me with the respect that I deserved back then too, when I was not able to.
100%. And I'm so glad that you are able to give this lesson to, the community and to others now, because it's valuable information. And really, just from my heart, I thank you. And I'm so sorry for what you did have to go through. And I'm so proud of you now for bringing this voice and this presence to the community. And what kind of support are you getting now at your 26? Like, what does that look like for you now in the community?
So I still need support for various different reasons, because, like, it doesn't go away. It just, like I said earlier, it just morphs. But yeah, I went through a period where I did not have good support at all, just because after high school they kind of just drop you, and then I was just not doing well at all, with constant hospitalizations, constant meltdowns. So now what I primarily have is I have a caseworker who, like, oversees everything with my housing to make sure that I'm okay. I'm on SSDI. I can't work full-time just with my disabilities. It's too much, but I am able to work part-time, very part-time, so 2 days a week. But that's still been really fulfilling for me. Like, my employer knows I'm disabled, and obviously it's visible too. But I'm really accepted there. So my casework helps out to make sure everything's going okay with that. See if I need support in that any area. So I use any assistive technology that I need if I ever nonverbal or any of those situations. I have assisted transportation, just because, again, like, it can be really overwhelming with driving, and just with my vision declining anyway, that's been more and more of a challenge. So there's different disability services that will take me anywhere that I need to go. I'm working with them in the sense of trying to get better, because they can be a hot mess with dropping me off, not picking me up, and that causes a whole other spiral.
Yeah.
So in my state, we're working on holding them accountable, because they've been on the news a few times for that.
Oh my gosh. I just made a petition this morning for something that happened in our community, where I just found out this morning too that it was an autistic child. I knew that they were disabled, but I didn't know to what degree, their disabilities met. And I don't know the circumstances. I just know that they were left in the vehicle of the care center and passed away. So I just started a petition this morning for vehicle safety regulations. They need to be held accountable. They need to have some type of a staff protocol where they're double checking, they park, then someone comes out, they double check the vehicle. Why not? How easy is that to have to have someone that's already there have that, they trade off. And I mean,
there's no excuse.
Somebody needs to be held accountable. And so, and it's unfortunate. And I don't want to hold blame to anyone or anything, but let's higher our standards. Let's make sure that we can stop these things from happening when we can be responsible adults.
So. No, I think a lot of it comes down to systemic failure. And this is actually what I was about to get into in a minute, but, like, I also have occupational therapy still. So that's been really helpful. I have a therapist that I talk to, because it's a lot of trauma to process. I haven't dug deep, because I don't know if this is a child-friendly podcast. So I don't want to go too deep.
You're totally fine. This is,
but it's
adult,
very,
but Yeah.
Okay, so I always double check. I just didn't know what the audience was.
Thank you. I
Sure.
appreciate it. I mean,
Um,
if people do listen with their families, that's their
yeah,
they're
no,
getting
so
parenting advice, and I can't imagine that'd be
right.
great for kids to hear
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah, okay, that's fair. No, so I've been institutionalized 40 times since
Wow. Oh
2006.
my
40 times.
gosh.
Like, I used to struggle quite intensely, to say as an understatement, just needing 24/7 support at certain points,
Yeah.
just because of different self-injury I was having. I mean, it was getting pretty severe with different bruising, and it was just a very bad time. And so what I was bringing back to that conversation about the ride is that anything that happens in human services positions, whether it's group homes or institutions or hospitals, ride a lot of it comes down to systemic failures. So
Yeah.
short staffing because staff are underpaid.
Yeah.
And if you're not going to stay at a job, if you're getting paid $12 an hour to do intense like private care or to do intense rides all day, because that's not an easy job. I give them a lot of credit. You know, you're driving folks with disabilities all day, and like that's not putting blame on us for being difficult. It's more like, okay, you're doing a lot of the buckling with big wheelchairs and equipment, and you have to respond to different demands throughout the all day. So like, if you're not getting paid adequately, a lot of them won't stay. And it's
Yeah.
not to say they're not passionate about the jobs, but they also have to feed their families, pay rent, etc. And so a lot of time when people are just getting, when short
Minimal care.
staffing happens, when short staff happens, it affects us directly, and it's not okay because it happens all the time with turnover. I'll get attached to a private care worker that I have, and they leave, or social workers leaving because they're not being paid enough, or there's turnover because the budget's getting cut and they get let go. I mean, it's constant. So same thing with the ride. That's what it's called in our area. It's literally called the MBTA ride. I know what your program is over in Utah. But when there's just, you're not getting paid and the demands are getting ridiculous and there's a lot of complaints flowing in, and it's not sustainable to have a few people doing like coordinating so many folks' rides in Massachusetts, people get overlooked, and that's how we get harmed, either medically or people can pass away in those. And it's inexcusable. But like, we have to look at, okay, it's not about getting this person fired, it's about what caused this to happen.
Yep.
And yes, it can be a thing too, where that's neglect. I'm not excusing at all, like that child should be alive, period.
Absolutely.
There's no reason for it. But I'm saying when that happens, we need to also go a step further.
Yep.
So I think that people tend to like just think, oh, I'm just gonna complain against this one teacher or something like that. It's like, no, like what's happening here?
Yeah.
Like, why is the IEP not being met?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of being like, you're not trying hard enough, or this teacher doesn't like you. And to be honest, that could be a thing too. Like, teachers are also human.
Yeah.
And so I felt like if a teacher didn't like me, I'm not going to connect with them. So the grades would be either falling or behavior would be escalating. I mean, I feel like a lot of the blame just constantly went back to me. And I was like, but look what happened. Why am I upset? Because my psychiatrist just left and my therapist just left. And, it was always like, at one point I lost my entire support team within the same month. And so I was bringing all these new people in. That's a big change. And I have a reactive attachment disorder too, so it took me a long time to like get used to them. I was fighting with them a lot, so it was just pretty chaotic. So I think that we need to, when we talk about especially autism or any type of disability justice, we have to look at the systemic failures going on, the trickle down dust, because it's always us that's going to get affected the most.
Absolutely.
There's no excuse.
And I have quite a community that is also RAD, and let's talk about that a little bit, because I think that that's something that isn't talked about enough, that isn't known in society. Reactive attachment disorder. And this is something that happens and occurs a lot in adoptions and in foster care and things like that. Tell us your experience with that, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, it definitely isn't talked about a lot, and I think it needs to be talked about more, because I think it's a way more common than it's
Absolutely.
Way more common. So I'm adopted from Paraguay. I'm indigenous, so I was adopted out of an indigenous tribe. And at the time, there was a lot of political drama going on in Paraguay. We just had a dictator overthrown who was doing genocide against like our tribe, and it was just a whole mess. So I was actually I stayed with my biological mother for a month, and then I was placed in their system. And Paraguay system was a hot mess at the time, to the point where I'm actually one of the last 50 people in the whole world right now to be adopted from Paraguay.
Wow.
Because they shut it down. That they had one main orphanage, and it was not sustainable for the country of Paraguay. You can't just have one big one.
Yeah.
And so the conditions were very bad. I was definitely suffering from malnutrition. Even they were sending letters to my parents that I have now, my adopted parents, and they said like, he looks really skinny in this. What's going on? And even said like, is he getting fed properly, or is he getting played with? Because I just did not look good in the photos. And so there was a lot of that I just wasn't getting the attention that I needed as a baby, and that's not my fault, as a baby.
Yeah.
But as that translates to when I was older, they, again, early stages, they kept thinking everything was just the autism, or this is just him adjusting to another country. Even though I was a baby, like it's still like I had to be nursed back to health from the malnutrition and all that. And so over time, it just translated to a lot of difficulty directly with my parents. That it was just hard to be loved because I was just it was just inherently planted in me that I was not worthy of being loved.
Yeah, you were
that I was scared of that.
Fight or flight constantly. You were in instinct mode from the get-go because you never had that bond to create the trust that was so necessary for you to not have the fight or flight.
Right, absolutely.
People don't understand that.
Yeah, and I think that I get frustrated with how the media portrays RAD. I think they kind of portray us as little sociopaths, and that's really not what it is. It's more of us pushing away and being more isolated because we're just so scared of getting hurt again. That like if we were crying and we wouldn't get our bottle, like that treats you as a little baby inherently. It's psychologically, like you're not going to have your needs. But I didn't have a name for it until I was 15 years old. I always thought that it was trauma from when I was 12 years old that made everything as bad as it was. But actually what happened, I'll go into that a little bit. I know it's very intense, but it is important to put context to it.